Interspecific competition. Interspecific competition, in ecology, is a form of competition in which individuals of different species compete for the same resources in an ecosystem, e.g. food or living space. This can be contrasted with mutualism, a type of symbiosis. Competition between members of the same species is called interspecific competition. Subadult male lion and female spotted hyena in the Masai Mara. The two species share the same ecological niche, and are thus in competition with each other. If a tree species in a dense forest grows taller than surrounding tree species, it is able to absorb more of the incoming sunlight. However, less sunlight is then available for the trees that are shaded by the taller tree, thus interspecific competition. Leopards and lions can also be in interspecific competition, since both species feed on the same prey, and can be negatively impacted by the presence of the other because they will have less food. Competition is only one of many interacting biotic and abiotic factors that affect community structure. Moreover, competition is not always a straightforward, direct interaction. Interspecific competition may occur when individuals of two separate species share a limiting resource in the same area. If the resource cannot support both populations, then lowered fecundity, growth, or survival may result in at least one species. Interspecific competition has the potential to alter populations, communities and the evolution of interacting species. On an individual organism level, competition can occur as interference or exploitative competition. Types. All of the types described here can also apply to interspecific competition, that is, competition among individuals within a species. Also, any specific example of interspecific competition can be described in terms of both a mechanism, e.g., resource or interference, and an outcome, symmetric or asymmetric. Moreover, competition is only one of many interacting biotic and abiotic factors that affect community structure. Moreover, competition is not always a straightforward, direct interaction. Interspecific competition may occur when individuals of two separate species share a limiting resource in the same area. If the resource cannot support both populations, then lowered fecundity, growth, or survival may result in at least one species. Interspecific competition has the potential to alter populations, communities and the evolution of interacting species. On an individual organism level, competition can occur as interference or exploitative competition. Types. All of the types described here can also apply to interspecific competition, that is, competition among individuals within a species. Also, any specific example of interspecific competition can be described in terms of both a mechanism, e.g., resource or interference, and an outcome, symmetric or asymmetric. Based on mechanism. Exploitative competition, also referred to as resource competition, is a form of competition in which one species consumes and either reduces or more efficiently uses a shared limiting resource and therefore depletes the availability of the resource for the other species. Thus, it is an indirect interaction because the competing species interact via a shared resource. Interference competition is a form of competition in which individuals of one species interacts directly with individuals of another species via antagonistic displays or more aggressive behavior. In a review and synthesis of experimental evidence regarding interspecific competition, Schoner 2 described 6 specific types of mechanisms by which competition occurs, including consumptive, preemptive, overgrowth, chemical, territorial, and encounter. Consumption competition is always resource competition, but the others cannot always be regarded as exclusively exploitative or interference. Separating the effect of resource use from consumption. Asymmetric. Based on mechanism. Exploitative competition, also referred to as resource competition, is a form of competition in which one species consumes and either reduces or more efficiently uses a shared limiting resource and therefore depletes the availability of the resource for the other species. Thus, it is an indirect interaction because the competing species interact via a shared resource. Interference competition is a form of competition in which individuals of one species interacts directly with individuals of another species via antagonistic displays or more aggressive behavior. In a review and synthesis of experimental evidence regarding interspecific competition, Schoner 2 described 6 specific types of mechanisms by which competition occurs, including consumptive, preemptive, overgrowth, chemical, territorial, and encounter. Consumption competition is always resource competition, but the others cannot always be regarded as exclusively exploitative or interference. Separating the effect of resource use from that of interference is not easy. A good example of exploitative competition is found in aphid species competing over the sap in plant phloem. Each aphid species that feeds on host plant sap uses some of the resource, leaving less for competing species. In one study, Fortinae geoica was observed to outcompete F. formicaria to the extent that the latter species exhibited a reduction in survival by 84%. Another example is the one of competition for calling space in amphibians, where the calling activity of a species prevents the other one from calling in an area as wide as it would in allopatry. 3. A last example is driving of bisexual rock lizards of genus Derevskia from their natural habitats by a daughter unisexual form. 4. Interference competition can be ruled out in this case, because parthenogenetic forms of the lizards never demonstrate aggressive behavior. This type of competition can also be observed in forests where large trees dominate the canopy and thus allow little light to reach smaller competitors living below. These interactions have important implications for the population dynamics and distribution of both species. Based on outcome. Scramble and contest competition refer to the relative success of competitors. Scramble competition is said to occur when each competitor is equal suppressed, either through reduction in survival or birth rates. Contest competition is said to occur when one or a few competitors are unaffected by competition, but all others suffer greatly, either through reduction in survival or birth rates. Sometimes these types of competition are referred to as symmetric, scramble versus asymmetric contest competition. Scramble and contest competition are two ends of a spectrum, of completely equal or completely unequal effects. Apparent competition. Apparent competition is actually an example of predation that alters the relative abundances of prey on the same trophic level. It occurs when two or more species in a habitat affect shared natural enemies in a higher trophic level. 5. If two species share a common predator, for example, apparent competition can exist between the two prey items in which the presence of each prey species increases the abundance of the shared enemy, and thereby suppresses one or both prey species. 6. This mechanism gets its name from experiments in which one prey species is removed and the second prey species increases in abundance. Investigators sometimes mistakenly attribute the increase in abundance in the second species as evidence for resource competition between prey species. It is, apparently, competition, but is in fact due to a shared predator, parasitoid, parasite, or pathogen. Notably, species competing for resources may often also share predators in nature. Interactions via resource competition and shared predation may thus often influence one another, thus making it difficult to study and predict their outcome by only studying one of them. 7. Consequences. Many studies, including those cited previously, have shown major impacts on both individuals and populations from interspecific competition. Documentation of these impacts has been found in species from every major branch of organism. The effects of interspecific competition can also reach communities and can even influence the evolution of species as they adapt to avoid competition. This evolution may result in the exclusion of a species in the habitat, niche separation, and local extinction. The changes of these species over time can also change communities as other species must adapt. Competitive exclusion. The competitive exclusion principle, also called Gauss's law, 8, which arose from mathematical analysis and simple competition models, states that two species that use the same limiting resource in the same way in the same space and time cannot coexist and must diverge from each other over time in order for the two species to coexist. One species will often exhibit an advantage in resource use. This superior competitor will outcompete the other with more efficient use of the limiting resource. As a result, the inferior competitor will suffer a decline in population over time. It will be excluded from the area and replaced by the superior competitor. A well-documented example of competitive exclusion was observed to occur between Dollyvarden char trout Salvelinus malma and white-spotted char trout S. leucomanus in Japan. Both of these species were morphologically similar, but the former species was found primarily at higher elevations than the latter. Although there was a zone of overlap, each species excluded the other from its dominant region by becoming better adapted to its habitat over time. In some such cases, each species gets displaced into an exclusive segment of the original habitat. Because each species suffers from competition, natural selection favors the avoidance of competition in such a way. Niche differentiation is a process by which competitive exclusion leads to differences in resource use. In some cases, niche differentiation results in spatial displacement, where species avoid direct competition by occupying different areas. However, niche differentiation can also cause other changes, such as altered behaviors or ecological roles, that help species avoid competition. If competition avoidance is possible, species may specialize in different areas of the niche, minimizing overlap and resource competition. Watson-Holekamp, 2008. For example, spotted hyenas Crocuta crocuta and lions Panthera leo in Africa share similar habitats and prey but have different hunting strategies. Hyenas use stamina to chase prey over long distances, while lions rely on ambush hunting. This difference in hunting strategies helps reduce direct competition for food. Hayward and Slowdow, 2009. Another example of niche differentiation comes from birds, where species with similar ecological requirements shift their behavior to avoid competition. In the Galapagos Islands, finch species have been observed to change their feeding habits within a few generations, adapting to new dietary resources to minimize competition. This adaptation allowed different finch species to coexist despite overlapping habitats and food sources. Kruik, 1972. Similarly, hyenas and lions may alter their roles in the ecosystem through spatial and behavioral differentiation, helping them avoid direct conflict and share resources. Grunewald et al., 2009. Similarly, hyenas and lions may alter their roles in the ecosystem through spatial and behavioral differentiation, helping them avoid direct conflict and share resources. Grunewald et al., 2009. In some ecosystems, niche differentiation is influenced by third-party species or predators. For example, a keystone predator can significantly alter the behavior of competing species. Hyenas, by preying on lions or scavenging their kills, can reduce the lion's ability to dominate a territory. This helps other predators and scavengers, like cheetahs, access resources they might otherwise be excluded from. Hayward and Slowdow, 2009. Additionally, in bacterial ecosystems, phage parasites have been shown to mediate coexistence between competing bacterial species by reducing the dominance of one species. This kind of interaction helps maintain biodiversity in microbial communities, which can have important implications for both medical research and ecological theory. Grunewald et al., 2009. Local extinction. Although local extinction of one or more competitors has been less documented than niche separation or competitive exclusion, it does occur. In an experiment involving zooplankton in artificial rock pools, local extinction rates were significantly higher in areas of interspecific competition. 9. In these cases, therefore, the negative effects are not only at the population level but also species richness of communities. Impacts on communities. Naturalized purple loose strife plants growing in the Cooper Marsh. Conservation area, near Cornwall, Ontario. As mentioned previously, interspecific competition has great impact on community composition and structure. Niche separation of species, local extinction and competitive exclusion are only some of the possible effects. In addition to these, interspecific competition can be the source of a cascade of effects that build on each other. An example of such an effect is the introduction of an invasive species to the United States, purple loose strife. This plant when introduced to wetland communities often outcompetes much of the native flora and decreases species richness, food and shelter to many other species at higher trophic levels. In this way, one species can influence the populations of many other species as well as through a myriad of other interactions. Because of the complicated web of interactions that make up every ecosystem and habitat, the results of interspecific competition are complex and site-specific. Competitive Lotka-Volterra model. The impacts of interspecific competition on populations have been formalized in a mathematical model called the competitive Lotka-Volterra equations, which creates a theoretical prediction of interactions. It combines the effects of each species on the other. These effects are calculated separately for the first and second population respectively. In these formulae, n is the population size, t is time, k is the carrying capacity, r is the intrinsic rate of increase and alpha and beta are the relative competition coefficients. 10. The results show the effect that the other species has on the species being calculated. The results can be graphed to show a trend and possible prediction for the future of the species. One problem with this model is that certain assumptions must be made for the calculation to work. These include the lack of migration and constancy of the carrying capacities and competition coefficients of both species. The complex nature of ecology determines that these assumptions are rarely true in the field, but the model provides a basis for improved understanding of these important concepts. An equivalent formulation of these models, 11, is. In these formulae, is the effect that an individual of species 1 has on its own population growth rate. Similarly, is the effect that an individual of species 2 has on the population growth rate of species 1. One can also read this as the effect on species 1 of species 2. In comparing this formulation to the one above, we note that, and coexistence between competitors occurs when n. We can translate this as coexistence occurs when the effect of each species on itself is greater than the effect of the competitor. There are other mathematical representations that model species competition, such as using nonpolynomial functions. 12. Interspecific competition in macroevolution. Interspecific competition is a major factor in macroevolution. 13. Darwin assumed that interspecific competition limits the number of species on Earth. As formulated in his wedge metaphor, nature may be compared to a surface covered with 10,000 sharp wedges, representing different species, all packed closely together and driven in by incessant blows. Sometimes a wedge of one form and sometimes another being struck, the one driven deeply and forcing out others, with the jar and shock often transmitted very far to other wedges in many lines of direction. From natural selection, the Big Book, from which Darwin abstracted the origin. 14. The question whether interspecific competition limits global biodiversity is disputed today. 15. But analytical studies of the global Phanerozoic fossil record are in accordance with the existence of global, although not constant, carrying capacities for marine biodiversity. 16. 17. Interspecific competition is also the basis for Van Valen's Red Queen hypothesis, and it may underlie the positive correlation between origination and extinction rates that is seen in almost all major taxa. 13. In the previous examples, the macroevolutionary role of interspecific competition is that of a limiting factor of biodiversity, but interspecific competition also promotes niche differentiation and thus speciation and diversification. Competitive. This plant when introduced to wetland community. This superior interspecific competition in macroevolution. Interspecific competition is a major factor in macroevolution. 13. Darwin assumed that interspecific competition limits the number of species on Earth. As formulated in his wedge metaphor, nature may be compared to a surface covered with 10,000 sharp wedges, representing different species, all packed closely together and driven in by incessant blows. Sometimes a wedge of one form and sometimes another being struck, the one driven deeply and forcing out others, with the jar and shock often transmitted very far to other wedges in many lines of direction. From natural selection, the Big Book, from which Darwin abstracted the origin. 14. The question whether interspecific competition limits global biodiversity is disputed today. 15. But analytical studies of the global Phanerozoic fossil record are in accordance with the existence of global, although not constant, carrying capacities for marine biodiversity. 16. 17. Interspecific competition is also the basis for Van Valen's Red Queen hypothesis, and it may underlie the positive correlation between origination and extinction rates that is seen in almost all major taxa. 13. In the previous examples, the macroevolutionary role of interspecific competition is that of a limiting factor of biodiversity, but interspecific competition also promotes niche differentiation and thus speciation and diversification. 18. 19. The impact of interspecific competition may therefore change during phases of diversity buildup, from an initial phase where positive feedback mechanisms dominate to a later phase when niche preemption limits further increase in the number of species. A possible example for this situation is the rediversification of marine faunas after the end Permian mass extinction event. 13. Darwin assumed that interspecific competition limits the number of species on Earth. As formulated in his wedge metaphor, nature may be compared to a surface covered with 10,000 sharp wedges, representing different species, all packed closely together and driven in by incessant blows. Sometimes a wedge of one form and sometimes another being struck, the one driven deeply and forcing out others, with the jar and shock often transmitted very far to other wedges in many lines of direction. From Natural Selection, the Big Book, from which Darwin abstracted the origin. 14. The question whether interspecific competition limits global biodiversity is disputed today. 15. But analytical studies of the global Phanerozoic fossil record are in accordance with the existence of global, although not constant, carrying capacities for marine biodiversity. 16. 17. Interspecific competition is also the basis for Van Valen's Red Queen hypothesis, and it may underlie the positive correlation between origination and extinction rates that is seen in almost all major taxa. 13. In the previous examples, the macroevolutionary role of interspecific competition is that of a limiting factor of biodiversity, but interspecific competition also promotes niche differentiation and thus speciation and diversification. 18. 19. The impact of interspecific competition may therefore change during phases of diversity buildup, from an initial phase where positive feedback mechanisms dominate to a later phase when niche preemption limits further increase in the number of species. A possible example for this situation is the rediversification of marine faunas after the end Permian mass extinction event. 20. See all. Interspecific competition. Interspecific competition is an interaction in population ecology, whereby members of the same species compete for limited resources. This leads to a reduction in fitness for both individuals, but the more fit individual survives and is able to reproduce. 1. By contrast, interspecific competition occurs when members of different species compete for a shared resource. Members of the same species have rather similar requirements for resources, whereas different species have a smaller contested resource overlap, resulting in interspecific competition generally being a stronger force than interspecific competition. 2. Male hartebeest locking horns and fiercely defending their territories. An example of direct competition. Individuals can compete for food, water, space, light, mates, or any other resource which is required for survival or reproduction. The resource must be limited for competition to occur. If every member of the species can obtain a sufficient amount of every resource, then individuals do not compete and the population grows exponentially. 1. Prolonged exponential growth is rare in nature because resources are finite and so not every individual in a population can survive, leading to interspecific competition for the scarce resources. When resources are limited, an increase in population size reduces the quantity of resources available for each individual, reducing the per capita fitness in the population. As a result, the growth rate of a population slows as interspecific competition becomes more intense, making it a negatively density-dependent process. The falling population growth rate as population increases can be modeled effectively with the logistic growth model. 3. The rate of change of population density eventually falls to zero, the point ecologists have termed the carrying capacity K. However, a population can only grow to a very limited number within an environment. 3. The carrying capacity, defined by the variable K, of an environment is the maximum number of individuals or species an environment can sustain and support over a longer period of time. 3. The resources within an environment are limited, and are not endless. 3. An environment can only support a certain number of individuals before its resources completely diminish. 3. Numbers larger than this will suffer a negative population growth until eventually reaching the carrying capacity, whereas populations smaller than the carrying capacity will grow until they reach it. 3. Interspecific competition does not just involve direct interactions between members of the same species, such as male deer locking horns when competing for mates, but can also include indirect interactions where an individual depletes a shared resource, such as a grizzly bear catching a salmon that can then no longer be eaten by bears at different points along a river. The way in which resources are partitioned by organisms also varies and can be split into scramble and contest competition. Scramble competition involves a relatively even distribution of resources among a population as all individuals exploit a common resource pool. In contrast, contest competition is the uneven distribution of resources and occurs when hierarchies in a population influence the amount of resource each individual receives. Organisms in the most prized territories or at the top of the hierarchies obtain a sufficient quantity of the resources, whereas individuals without a territory don't obtain any of the resource. 1. Mechanisms. Direct interference competition is the process by which individuals directly compete with one another in pursuit of a resource. It can involve fighting, stealing, or ritualized combat. Direct interspecific competition also includes animals claiming a territory which then excludes other animals from entering the area. There may not be an actual conflict between the two competitors, but the animal excluded from the territory suffers a fitness loss due to a reduced foraging area and is unable to enter the area as it risks confrontation from a more dominant member of the population. As organisms are encountering each other during interference competition, they are able to evolve behavioral strategies and morphologies to outcompete rivals in their population. 4. Flamingos competing via interference competition. Potentially for territories, mates, or food. For example, different populations of the northern slimy salamander, Plethodon glutinosus, have evolved varying levels of aggression depending on the intensity of intraspecific competition. In populations where the resources are scarcer, more aggressive behaviors are likely to evolve. It is a more effective strategy to fight rivals within the species harder instead of searching for other options due to the lack of available food. 5. More aggressive salamanders are more likely to obtain the resources they require to reproduce, whereas timid salamanders may starve before reproducing, so aggression can spread through the population. In addition, a study on Chilean flamingos, Phoenicopterus chilensis, found that birds in a band were much more aggressive than single birds. The paired birds were significantly more likely to start an agonistic encounter in defense of their mate or young, whereas single birds were typically non-breeding and less likely to fight. 6. Not all flamingos can mate in the population because of an unsuitable sex ratio or some dominant flamingos mating with multiple partners. Mates are a fiercely contested resource in many species as the production of offspring is essential for an individual to propagate its genes. Indirect. Organisms can compete indirectly, either via exploitative or apparent competition. Exploitative competition involves individuals depleting a shared resource and both suffering a loss in fitness as a result. The organisms may not actually come into contact and only interact via the shared resource indirectly. For instance, exploitative competition has been shown experimentally between juvenile wolf spiders, Schizocosa acrita. Both increasing the density of young spiders and reducing the available food supply lowered the growth of individual spiders. Food is clearly a limiting resource for the wolf spiders, but there was no direct competition between juveniles for food, just a reduction in fitness due to the increased population density. 7. The negative density dependence in young wolf spiders is evident. As the population density increases further, growth rates continues to fall and could potentially reach zero, as predicted by the logistic growth model. This is also seen in viviparous lizard, or Lacerta vivipara, where the existence of color morphs within a population depends on the density and interspecific competition. In stationary organisms, such as plants, exploitative competition plays a much larger role than interference competition because individuals are rooted to a specific area and utilize resources in their immediate surroundings. Saplings will compete for light, most of which will be blocked and utilized by taller trees. 8. The saplings can be easily outcompeted by larger members of their own species, which is one of the reasons why seed dispersal distances can be so large. Seeds that germinate in close proximity to the parents are very likely to be outcompeted and die. Apparent competition occurs in populations that are predated upon. An increase in population of the prey species will bring more predators to the area, which increases the risk of an individual being eaten and hence lowers its survivorship. Like exploitative competition, the individuals aren't interacting directly but rather suffer a reduction in fitness as a consequence of the increasing population size. Apparent competition is generally associated with inter rather than interspecific competition, whereby two different species share a common predator. An adaptation that makes one species less likely to be eaten results in a reduction in fitness for the other prey species because the predator species hunts more intensely as food has become more difficult to obtain. For example, native skinks Oligosoma in New Zealand suffered a large decline in population after the introduction of rabbits Oryctolagus cuniculus. 9. Both species are eaten by ferrets Mustela furo, so the introduction of rabbits resulted in immigration of ferrets to the area, which then depleted skink numbers. Resource partitioning. Contest. Contest competition takes place when a resource is associated with a territory or hierarchical structure within the population. For instance, white-faced capuchin monkeys, Cebus capucinus, have different energy intakes based on their ranking within the group. 10. Both males and females compete for territories with the best access to food, and the most successful monkeys are able to obtain a disproportionately large quantity of food and therefore have a higher fitness in comparison to the subordinate members of the group. In the case of Ctenophorus pictus lizards, males compete for territory. Among the polymorphic variants, red lizards are more aggressive in defending their territory compared to their yellow counterparts. 11. Aggressive encounters are potentially costly for individuals as they can get injured and be less able to reproduce. As a result, many species have evolved forms of ritualized combat to determine who wins access to a resource without having to undertake a dangerous fight. Male adders Vipera berus undertake complex ritualized confrontations when courting females. Generally, the larger male will win and fights rarely escalate to injury to either combatant. 12. However, sometimes the resource may be so prized that potentially fatal confrontations can occur to acquire them. Male elephant seals, Mirounga augustirostris, engage in fierce competitive displays in an attempt to control a large harem of females with which to mate. The distribution of females and subsequent reproductive success is very uneven between males. The reproductive success of most males is zero, they die before breeding age or are prevented from mating by higher-ranked males. In addition, just a few dominant males account for the majority of copulations. 13. The potential reproductive success for males is so great that many are killed before breeding age as they attempt to move up the hierarchy in their population. In the case of Ctenophorus pictus lizards, males compete for territory. Among the polymorphic variants, red lizards are more aggressive in defending their territory compared to their yellow counterparts. 11. Aggressive encounters are potentially costly for individuals as they can get injured and be less able to reproduce. As a result, many species have evolved forms of ritualized combat to determine who wins access to a resource without having to undertake a dangerous fight. Male adders Vipera berus undertake complex ritualized confrontations when courting females. Generally, the larger male will win and fights rarely escalate to injury to either combatant. 12. However, sometimes the resource may be so prized that potentially fatal confrontations can occur to acquire them. Male elephant seals, Mirounga augustirostris, engage in fierce competitive displays in an attempt to control a large harem of females with which to mate. The distribution of females and subsequent reproductive success is very uneven between males. The reproductive success of most males is zero, they die before breeding age or are prevented from mating by higher-ranked males. In addition, just a few dominant males account for the majority of copulations. 13. The potential reproductive success for males is so great that many are killed before breeding age as they attempt to move up the hierarchy in their population. Contest competition produces relatively stable population dynamics. The uneven distribution of resources results in some individuals dying off but helps to ensure that the members of the population that hold a territory can reproduce. The uneven distribution of contest competition produces relatively stable population dynamics. The uneven distribution of resources results in some individuals dying off but helps to ensure that the members of the population that hold a territory can reproduce. As the number of territories in an area stays the same over time, the breeding population remains constant, which produces a similar number of new individuals every breeding season. Scramble. Scramble competition involves a more equal distribution of resources than contest competition and occurs when there is a common resource pool that an individual cannot be excluded from. For instance, grazing animals compete more strongly for grass as their population grows and food becomes a limiting resource. Each herbivore receives less food as more individuals compete for the same quantity of food. 4. Scramble completion can lead to unstable population dynamics. The equal division of resources can result in very few of the organisms obtaining enough to survive and reproduce, and this can cause population crashes. This phenomenon is called overcompensation. For instance, grazing animals. 13. In addition, just a few dominant males account for the majority of population. The uneven distribution of resources results in some individuals dying off but helps to ensure that the members of the population that hold a territory can reproduce. As the number of territories in an area stays the same over time, the breeding population remains constant, which produces a similar number of new individuals every breeding season. Scramble. Scramble competition involves a more equal distribution of resources than contest competition and occurs when there is a common resource pool that an individual cannot be excluded from. For instance, grazing animals compete more strongly for grass as their population grows and food becomes a limiting resource. Each herbivore receives less food as more individuals compete for the same quantity of food. 4. Scramble completion can lead to unstable population dynamics. The equal division of resources can result in very few of the organisms obtaining enough to survive and reproduce, and this can cause population crashes. This phenomenon is called overcompensation. For instance, the caterpillars of cinnabar moths feed via scramble competition, and when there are too many caterpillars competing, very few are able to pupate and there is a large population crash. 14. Subsequently, very few cinnabar moths are competing intraspecifically in the next generation, so the population grows rapidly before crashing again. Consequences of intraspecific competition. Slowed growth rates. Exponential human population growth in the last 1,000 years. The major impact of intraspecific competition is reduced population growth rates as population density increases. When resources are infinite, intraspecific competition does not occur and populations can grow exponentially. Exponential population growth is exceedingly rare, but has been documented, most notably in humans since 1900. Elephant Loxodonta africana populations in Kruger National Park, South Africa, also grew exponentially in the mid-1900s after strict poaching controls were put in place. 15. DNT dt equals rate of change of population density and T equals population size at time T. R equals per capita growth rate. K equals carrying capacity. Population growth against time in a population growing logistically. The steepest parts of the graph are where the population growth is most rapid. The logistic growth equation is an effective tool for modeling intraspecific competition despite its simplicity, and has been used to model many real biological systems. At low population densities, NT is much smaller than K, and so the main determinant for population growth is just the per capita growth rate. However, as NT approaches the carrying capacity, the second term in the logistic equation becomes smaller, reducing the rate of change of population density. 16. The logistic growth curve is initially very similar to the exponential growth curve. When population density is low, individuals are free from competition and can grow rapidly. However, as the population reaches its maximum, the carrying capacity, intraspecific competition becomes fiercer and the per capita growth rate slows until the population reaches a stable size. At the carrying capacity, the rate of change of population density is zero because the population is as large as possible based on the resources available. 4 experiments on Daphnia growth rates showed a striking adherence to the logistic growth curve. 17. The inflection point in the Daphnia population density graph occurred at half the carrying capacity, as predicted by the logistic growth model. Gaz's 1930s lab experiments showed logistic growth in microorganisms. Populations of yeast grown in test tubes initially grew exponentially, but as resources became scarcer, their growth rates slowed until reaching the carrying capacity. 3. If the populations were moved to a larger container with more resources, they would continue to grow until reaching their new carrying capacity. The shape of their growth can be modeled very effectively with the logistic growth model. Scramble competition. In ecology, scramble competition, or complete symmetric competition or exploitation competition, refers to a situation in which a resource is accessible to all competitors, that is, it is not monopolizable by an individual or group. However, since the particular resource is usually finite, scramble competition may lead to decreased survival rates for all competitors if the resource is used to its carrying capacity. Scramble competition is also defined as a finite resource that is shared equally amongst the competitors so that the quantity of food per individual declines with increasing population density. 1. A further description of scramble competition is competition for a resource that is inadequate for the needs of all, but which is partitioned equally among contestants, so that no competitor obtains the amount it needs and all would die in extreme cases. Grass can be a limited resource for grazing cows. Types of intraspecific competition. Researchers recognize two main forms of intraspecific competition, where members of a species are all using a shared resource in short supply. These are contest competition and scramble competition. 1. Contest competition. Contest competition is a form of competition where there is a winner and a loser and where resources can be attained completely or not at all. Contest competition sets up a situation where each successful competitor obtains all resources it requires for survival or reproduction. 1. Here, contest refers to the fact that physical action plays an active role in securing the resource. Contest competition involves resources that are stable, i.e. food or mates. Contests can be for a ritual objective such as territory or status, and losers may return to the competition another day to try again. 3. Scramble competition. In scramble competition resources are limited, which may lead to group member starvation. 3. Contest competition is often the result of aggressive social domains, including hierarchies or social chains. 4. Conversely, scramble competition is what occurs by accident when competitors naturally want the same resources. 4. These two forms of competition can be interwoven into one another. Some researchers have noted parallels between intraspecific behaviors of competition and cooperation. 4. These two processes can be evolutionarily adopted and they can also be accidental, which makes sense given the aggressive competition and collaborative cooperation aspects of social behavior in humans and animals. 4. To date, few studies have looked at the interplay between contest and scramble competition, despite the fact that they do not occur in isolation. There appears to be little understanding of the interface between contest competition and scramble competition in insects. 5. Much research still needs to be conducted concerning the overlap of contest and scramble competition systems. 5. Contests can arise within a scramble competition system and conversely, scramble competition may play a role in a system characterized by interference. 5. Population effects. Population can be greatly affected by scramble competition and contest competition. Intraspecific competition normally leads to a decline of organisms. For example, the more time that an individual spends seeking food and reproduction opportunities, the less energy that organism naturally has to defend oneself against predators, resulting in a zero-sum game. 2. Competition is a density-dependent effect, and scramble competition is no exception. Scramble competition usually involves interactions among individuals of the same species, which makes competition balanced and often leads to a decline of population growth rate as the amount of resources depletes. 6. The Ricker model, 1, is used to model scramble competition. It was originally formulated to study the growth of salmon populations and is given by the equation Pn plus 1 equals R Pn equals Pn 1 Pn K, where Pn is the population at the nth time period, R is the Malthusian growth rate, and K is the carrying capacity of the population. The Ricker model, and a few other well-known population models, can be explicitly derived from individual-level processes assuming scramble competition and a random distribution of individuals among resources. 7. Some researchers have noted that in certain species, such as the horseshoe crab, males are most successful at mating when they are able to practice scramble competition polygyny where they do not defend their territory but rather mate and move on, thus providing the highest likelihood of species survival and reproductive prowess. 8. Examples. There are many examples of scramble competition within the environment. For example, cows grazing in a grassland could be operating under a scramble competition. This illustration of cows eating grass is scramble competition because there are limited resources, there is only so much grass to be eaten before all the food resources depleted. Additionally, there is no way that others can limit the amount of resources or the access to resources that the other cows receive. 9. Another example of scramble competition is forest defoliators. If their larvae can find shelter and food then survival is possible, but when all the foliage is destroyed then the population decreases. Their synchronized life cycle increases competition for specific resources. This greatly affects their ability to receive resources including food and shelter due to the overwhelming population increase at certain times of the year. 6. The red-spotted newt exhibits sexual dimorphism. Scramble competition can also be seen with the example of red-spotted newts. Charles Darwin 1871 first explored the concept of sexual dimorphism, which states that most sexually dimorphic species are also the most polygynous, which would enable males to outcompete other males through female choice, combat, or scrambles to encounter females would be favored by selection, and sexual dimorphism would result. 10. The key to red-spotted newts' increased success in scramble competition is the newt's enhanced or strengthened tail fins. 10. Another example of scramble competition is the success of small beetles over large beetles. 11. While larger beetles, similar to larger animals in general, tend to win more often in contest competition, the opposite can be true in a scramble competition. 11. Specifically with beetles, scramble competition is dependent on male movement and locomotion so that the beetle that can move faster is more likely to be successful in attaining resources, mates and food. Smaller beetles fare better in scramble competition for shelter, which could one day lead to the evolutionary adaptation of smaller beetle structures for survival purposes. The flux of contest and scramble competition in this example is important to note because it truly depends on the context of each individual to determine which type of competition is most suitable. Scramble competition also exists in lepidopterans. For example, male morning-cloaked butterflies will fly around in search for widely dispersed females. 12. Another example of scramble competition exists in Lactrodectus hesperus, the western black widow spider. There is a male bias or skew within the sexually active population of this species, which means that females are a finite resource. So, while no male has a monopoly over the females, the males who reach the female first will come out on top in the world of sexual reproduction. 13. Parasitism is a chip between species, where one organism, the parasite, lives on or inside another organism, the host, causing it some harm, and is adapted structurally to this way of life. 1. The entomologist E.O. Wilson characterized parasites as predators that eat prey in units of less than 1. 2. Parasites include single-celled protozoans such as the agents of malaria, sleeping sickness, and amoebic dysentery, animals such as hookworms, lice, mosquitoes, and vampire bats, fungi such as honey fungus and The agents of ringworm, and plants such as mistletoe, dodder, and the broom rapes. A fish parasite, the isopod Symathoa exigua, replacing the tongue of Olithognathus. There are 6 major parasitic strategies of exploitation of animal hosts, namely parasitic castration, directly transmitted parasitism, by contact trophically transmitted parasitism, by being eaten vector-transmitted parasitism, parasitoidism, and micropredation. One major axis of classification concerns invasiveness. An endoparasite lives inside the host's body, an ectoparasite lives outside, on the host's surface. Like predation, parasitism is a type of consumer resource interaction. 3. But unlike predators, parasites, with the exception of parasitoids, are much smaller than their hosts, do not kill them, and often live in or on their hosts for an extended period. Parasites of animals are highly specialized, each parasite species living on one given animal species, and reproduce at a faster rate than their hosts. Classic examples include interactions between vertebrate hosts and tapeworms, flukes, and those between the malaria-causing Plasmodium species, and fleas. Parasites reduce host fitness by general or specialized pathology, that ranges from parasitic castration to modification of host behavior. Parasites increase their own fitness by exploiting hosts for resources necessary for their survival, in particular by feeding on them and by using intermediate, secondary hosts to assist in their transmission from one definitive primary host to another. Although parasitism is often unambiguous, it is part of a spectrum of interactions between species, grading via parasitoidism into predation, through evolution into mutualism, and in some fungi, shading into being saprophytic. Human knowledge of parasites such as roundworms and tapeworms dates back to ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. In early modern times, Antony van Leeuwenhoek observed Giardia lamblia with his microscope in 1681, while Francesco Redi described internal and external parasites including sheep liver fluke and ticks. Modern parasitology developed in the 19th century. In human culture, parasitism has negative connotations. These were exploited to satirical effect in Jonathan Swift's 1733 poem, On Poetry, a rhapsody, comparing poets to hyperparasitical vermin. In fiction, Bram Stoker's 1897 Gothic horror novel Dracula and its many later adaptations featured a blood-drinking parasite. Ridley Scott's 1979 film Alien was one of many works of science fiction to feature a parasitic alien species. 4. Etymology. First used in English in 1539, the word parasite comes from the medieval French parasite, from the Latinized form parasitus, from ancient Greek parasitos 5 parasitos, one who eats at the table of another, in turn from para 6 para beside, by, and cetos wheat, food. 7. The related term parasitism appears in English from 1611. 8. Evolutionary strategies. Basic concepts. Head scolex of tapeworm Taenia solium, an intestinal parasite, has hooks and suckers to attach to its host. Parasitism is a kind of symbiosis, a close and persistent long-term biological interaction between a parasite and its host. Unlike saprotrophs, parasites feed on living hosts, though some parasitic fungi, for instance, may continue to feed on hosts they have killed. Unlike commensalism and mutualism, the parasitic relationship harms the host, either feeding on it or, as in the case of intestinal parasites, consuming some of its food. Because parasites interact with other species, they can readily act as vectors of pathogens, causing disease. 9, 10, 11. Predation is by definition not a symbiosis, as the interaction is brief, but the entomologist E.O. Wilson has characterized parasites as predators that eat prey in units of less than 1. 2. Within that scope are many possible strategies. Taxonomists classify parasites in a variety of overlapping schemes, based on their interactions with their hosts and on their life cycles, which can be complex. An obligate parasite depends completely on the host to complete its life cycle, while a facultative parasite does not. Parasite life cycles involving only one host are called direct, those with a definitive host, where the parasite reproduces sexually, and at least one intermediate host are called indirect. 12, 13. An endoparasite lives inside the host's body, an ectoparasite lives outside, on the host's surface. 14. Mesoparasites, like some copepods, for example, enter an opening in the host's body and remain partly embedded there. 15. Some parasites can be generalists, feeding on a wide range of hosts, but many parasites, and the majority of protozoans and helminths that parasitize animals, are specialists and extremely host-specific. 14. An early basic, functional division of parasites distinguished microparasites and macroparasites. These each had a mathematical model assigned in order to analyze the population movements of the host parasite groupings. 16. The microorganisms and viruses that can reproduce and complete their life cycle within the host are known as microparasites. Macroparasites are the multicellular organisms that reproduce and complete their life cycle outside of the host or on the hosts. Body. 16, 17. Much of the thinking on types of parasitism has focused on terrestrial animal parasites of animals, such as helminths. Those in other environments and with other hosts often have analogous strategies. For example, the snub-nosed eel is probably a facultative endoparasite, i.e., it is semiparasitic that opportunistically burrows into and eats sick and dying fish. 18. Plant-eating insects such as scale insects, aphids, and caterpillars closely resemble ectoparasites, attacking much larger plants. They serve as vectors of bacteria, fungi and viruses which cause plant diseases. As female scale insects cannot move, they are obligate parasites, permanently attached to their hosts. 16. The sensory inputs that a parasite employs to identify and approach a potential host are known as host cues. Such cues can include, for example, vibration, 19. Exhaled carbon dioxide, skin odors, visual and heat signatures, and moisture. 20. Parasitic plants can use, for example, light, host physiochemistry, and volatiles to recognize potential hosts. 21. Major strategies. There are 6 major parasitic strategies, namely parasitic castration, directly transmitted parasitism, tropically transmitted parasitism, vector-transmitted parasitism, parasitoidism, and micropredation. These apply to parasites whose hosts are plants as well as animals. 16.22. These strategies represent adaptive peaks. Intermediate strategies are possible, but organisms in many different groups have consistently converged on these 6, which are evolutionarily stable. 22. A perspective on the evolutionary options can be gained by considering 4 key questions: the effect on the fitness of a parasite's hosts, the number of hosts they have per life stage, whether the host is prevented from reproducing, and whether the effect depends on intensity, number of parasites per host. From this analysis, the major evolutionary strategies of parasitism emerge, alongside predation. 23. Evolutionary strategies in parasitism and predation. 23. Intensity dependent, green, Roman. Intensity independent, purple, italics. Host fitness: single host, stays alive; single host, dies; multiple hosts able to reproduce. Fitness greater than O. Conventional parasite pathogen. Trophically transmitted parasite, a trophically transmitted pathogen. Micropredator. Unable to reproduce, fitness equals O. Parasitic castrator. Trophically transmitted parasitic castrator. Parasitoid. Social predator. B. Solitary predator. Parasitic castrators. The parasitic castrator Sacculina carcini, highlighted, attached to its crab host. Parasitic castrators partly or completely destroy their host's ability to reproduce, diverting the energy that would have gone into reproduction into host and parasite growth, sometimes causing gigantism in the host. The host's other systems remain intact, allowing it to survive and to sustain the parasite. 22-24. Parasitic crustaceans such as those in the specialized barnacle genus Sacculina specifically cause damage to the gonads of their many species. 25. Of host crabs. In the case of Sacculina, the testes of over 2/3 of their crab hosts degenerate sufficiently for these male crabs to develop female secondary sex characteristics such as broader abdomens, smaller claws and egg-grasping appendages. Various species of helminth castrate their hosts such as insects and snails. This may happen directly, whether mechanically by feeding on their gonads, or by secreting a chemical that destroys reproductive cells, or indirectly, whether by secreting a hormone or by diverting nutrients. For example, the trematode Zoogonus laceus, whose sporocysts lack mouths, castrates the intertidal marine snail Tricha obsoleta chemically, developing in its gonad and killing its reproductive cells. 24-26. Directly transmitted. Human head lice are directly transmitted obligate ectoparasites. Directly transmitted parasites, not requiring a vector to reach their hosts, include such parasites of terrestrial vertebrates as lice and mites, marine parasites such as copepods and cyanid amphipods, monogenes, and many species of nematodes, fungi, protozoans, bacteria, and viruses. Whether endoparasites or ectoparasites, each has a single host species. Within that species, most individuals are free or almost free of parasites, while a minority carry a large number of parasites. This is known as an aggregated distribution. 22. Trophically transmitted. Clonorchis sinensis, the Chinese liver fluke, is trophically transmitted. Trophically transmitted parasites are transmitted by being eaten by a host. They include trematodes, all except schistosomes, cestodes, acanthocephalans, pentastomids, many roundworms, and many protozoa such as toxoplasma. 22. They have complex life cycles involving hosts of 2 or more species. In their juvenile stages they infect and often encyst in the intermediate host. When the intermediate host animal is eaten by a predator, the definitive host, the parasite survives the digestion process and matures into an adult, some live as intestinal parasites. Many trophically transmitted parasites modify the behavior of their intermediate hosts, increasing their chances of being eaten by a predator. As with directly transmitted parasites, the distribution of trophically transmitted parasites among host individuals is aggregated. 22. Co-infection by multiple parasites is common. 27. Autoinfection, where by exception the whole of the parasite's life cycle takes place in a single primary host, can sometimes occur in helminths such as Strongyloides stercoralis. 28. Vector transmitted. The vector-transmitted protozoan endoparasite trypanosoma among human red blood cells. Vector-transmitted parasites rely on a third party, an intermediate host, where the parasite does not reproduce sexually. 14. To carry them from one definitive host to another. 22. These parasites are microorganisms, namely protozoa, bacteria, or viruses, often intracellular pathogens, disease causers. 22. Their vectors are mostly hematophagic arthropods such as fleas, lice, ticks, and mosquitoes. 22-29. For example, the deer tick Ixodes scapularis acts as a vector for diseases including Lyme disease, babesiosis, and anaplasmosis. 30. Protozoan endoparasites, such as the malarial parasites in the genus Plasmodium and sleeping sickness parasites in the genus Trypanosoma, have infective stages in the host's blood which are transported to new hosts by biting insects. 31. Parasitoids. Parasitoids are insects which sooner or later kill their hosts, placing their relationship close to predation. 32. Most parasitoids are parasitoid wasps or other hymenopterans, others include dipterans such as phorid flies. They can be divided into two groups, idiobionts and koinobionts, differing in their treatment of their hosts. 33. Idiobiont parasitoids sting their often large prey on capture, either killing them outright or paralyzing them immediately. The immobilized prey is then carried to a nest, sometimes alongside other prey if it is not large enough to support a parasitoid throughout its development. An egg is laid on top of the prey and the nest is then sealed. The parasitoid develops rapidly through its larval and pupal stages, feeding on the provisions left for it. 33. Koinobiont parasitoids, which include flies as well as wasps, lay their eggs inside young hosts, usually larvae. These are allowed to go on growing, so the host and parasitoid develop together for an extended period, ending when the parasitoids emerge as adults, leaving the prey dead, eaten from inside. Some koinobionts regulate their host's development, for example preventing it from pupating or making it molt whenever the parasitoid is ready to molt. They may do this by producing hormones that mimic a host's molting hormones, e.g. steroids, or by regulating the host's endocrine system. 33. Idiobiont parasitoid wasps immediately paralyze their hosts. For their larvae, pimplinae, pictured to eat. 22. Koinobiont parasitoid wasps like this braconid lay their eggs via an ovipositor inside their hosts, which continue to grow and molt. Phorid fly, center left, is laying eggs in the abdomen of a worker honeybee, altering its behavior. Micropredators. Mosquitoes are micropredators and important vectors of disease. A micropredator attacks more than one host, reducing each host's fitness by at least a small amount, and is only in contact with any one host intermittently. This behavior makes micropredators suitable as vectors, as they can pass smaller parasites from one host to another. 22, 23, 34. Most micropredators are hematophagic, feeding on blood. They include annelids such as leeches, crustaceans such as branchiurans and gnathid isopods, various dipterans such as mosquitoes and tsetse flies, other arthropods such as fleas and ticks, vertebrates such as lampreys, and mammals such as vampire bats. 22. Transmission strategies. Life cycle of Entamoeba histolytica, an anaerobic parasitic protozoan transmitted by the fecal-oral route. Parasites use a variety of methods to infect animal hosts, including physical contact, the fecal-oral route, free-living infectious stages, and vectors, suiting their differing hosts, life cycles, and ecological contexts. 35 examples to illustrate some of the many possible combinations are given in the table. Variations. Among the many variations on parasitic strategies are hyperparasitism, 37 social parasitism, 38 brood parasitism, 39 kleptoparasitism, 40 sexual parasitism, 41 and adelphoparasitism. 42. Hyperparasitism. Hyperparasites feed on another parasite, as exemplified by protozoa living in helminth parasites. 37 are facultative or obligate parasitoids whose hosts are either conventional parasites or parasitoids. 22, 33 levels of parasitism beyond secondary also occur, especially among facultative parasitoids. In oak gall systems, there can be up to 5 levels of parasitism. 43. Hyperparasites can control their hosts' populations, and are used for this purpose in agriculture and to some extent in medicine. The controlling effects can be seen in the way that the CHV1 virus helps to control the damage that chestnut blight, Cryphonectria parasitica, does to American chestnut trees, and in the way that bacteriophages can limit bacterial infections. It is likely, though little researched, that most pathogenic microparasites have hyperparasites which may prove widely useful in both agriculture and medicine. 44. Social parasitism. Social parasites take advantage of interspecific interactions between members of eusocial animals such as ants, termites, and bumblebees. Examples include the large blue butterfly, Phangarus aurean, its larva employing ant mimicry to parasitize certain ants, 38 Bombus bohemicus, a bumblebee which invades the hives of other bees and takes over reproduction while their young are raised by host workers, and Melipona scutillaris, a eusocial bee whose virgin queens escape killer workers and invade another colony without a queen. 45. An extreme example of interspecific social parasitism is found in the ant Tetramorium inquilinum, an obligate parasite which lives exclusively on the backs of other Tetramorium ants. 46. A mechanism for the evolution of social parasitism was first proposed by Carlo Emery in 1909. 47. Now known as Emery's rule, it states that social parasites tend to be closely related to their hosts, often being in the same genus. 48, 49, 50. Intraspecific social parasitism occurs in parasitic nursing, where some individual young take milk from unrelated females. In wedge-capped capuchins, higher-ranking females sometimes take milk from low-ranking females without any reciprocation. 51. Brood parasitism. In brood parasitism, the hosts suffer increased parental investment and energy expenditure to feed parasitic young, which are commonly larger than host young. The growth rate of host nestlings is slowed, reducing the host's fitness. Brood parasites include birds in different families such as cowbirds, whiteds, cuckoos, and black-headed ducks. These do not build nests of their own, but leave their eggs in nests of other species. In the family Ecology, over 40% of cuckoo species are obligate brood parasites, while others are either facultative brood parasites or provide parental care. 52. The eggs of some brood parasites mimic those of their hosts, while some cowbird eggs have tough shells, making them hard for the hosts to kill by piercing, both mechanisms implying selection by the hosts against parasitic eggs. 39. 53. 54. The adult female European cuckoo further mimics a predator, the European sparrowhawk, giving her time to lay her eggs in the host's nest unobserved. 55. Host species often combat parasitic egg mimicry through egg polymorphism, having two or more egg phenotypes within a single population of a species. Multiple phenotypes in host eggs decrease the probability of a parasitic species accurately matching their eggs to host eggs. 56. Kleptoparasitism. In kleptoparasitism, from Greek kleps, thief, parasites steal food gathered by the host. The parasitism is often on close relatives, whether within the same species or between species in the same genus or family. For instance, the many lineages of cuckoo bees lay their eggs in the nest cells of other bees in the same family. 40. Kleptoparasitism is uncommon generally but conspicuous in birds. Some such as skuas are specialized in pirating food from other seabirds, relentlessly chasing them down until they disgorge their catch. 57. Sexual parasitism. A unique approach is seen in some species of anglerfish, such as Ceratias holboli, where the males are reduced to tiny sexual parasites, wholly dependent on females of their own species for survival, permanently attached below the female's body, and unable to fend for themselves. The female nourishes the male and protects him from predators, while the male gives nothing back except the sperm that the female needs to produce the next generation. 41. Adelphoparasitism. Adelphoparasitism, from Greek adelphos brother, 58, also known as sibling parasitism, occurs where the host species is closely related to the parasite, often in the same family or genus. 42. In the citrus blackfly parasitoid, Incarcia perplexa, unmated females may lay haploid eggs in the fully developed larva of their own species, producing male offspring. 59. While the marine worm Bonellia viridis has a similar reproductive strategy, although the larvae are planktonic. 6. 41. Adelphoparasitism. Adelphoparasitism, from Greek adelphos brother, 58, also known as sibling parasitism, occurs where the host species is closely related to the parasite, often in the same family or genus. 42. In the citrus blackfly parasitoid, Incarcia perplexa, unmated females may lay haploid eggs in the fully developed larva of their own species, producing male offspring. 59. While the marine worm Bonellia viridis has a similar reproductive strategy, although the larvae are planktonic. 60. Illustrations. Examples of the major variant strategies are illustrated. A hyperparasitoid pteromallid wasp on the cocoons of its host, itself a parasitoid braconid wasp. The large blue butterfly is an ant mimic and social parasite. In brood parasitism, the host raises a young of another species, here a cowbird's egg, that has been laid in its nest. The great skua is a powerful kleptoparasite, relentlessly pursuing other seabirds until they disgorge their catches of food. The male of the anglerfish species Ceratias holboli lives as a tiny sexual parasite permanently attached below the female's body. Incarcia perplexa, center, a parasitoid of citrus blackfly, lower left, is also an adelphoparasite, laying eggs in larvae of its own species. Predation. Predation is a biological interaction where one organism, the predator, kills and eats another organism, its prey. It is one of a family of common feeding behaviors that includes parasitism and micropredation, which usually do not kill the host, and parasitoidism, which always does, eventually. It is distinct from scavenging on dead prey, though many predators also scavenge. It overlaps with herbivora, as seed predators and destructive frugivores are predators. Solitary predator. A polar bear feeds on a bearded seal it has killed. Social predators. Meat ants cooperate to feed on a cicada far larger than themselves. Predators may actively search for or pursue prey or wait for it, often concealed. When prey is detected, the predator assesses whether to attack it. This may involve ambush or pursuit predation, sometimes after stalking the prey. If the attack is successful, the predator kills the prey, removes any inedible parts like the shell or spines, and eats it. Predators are adaptive and often highly specialized for hunting, with acute senses such as vision, hearing, or smell. Many predatory animals, both vertebrate and invertebrate, have sharp claws or jaws to grip, kill, and cut up their prey. Other adaptations include stealth and aggressive mimicry that improve hunting efficiency. Predation has a powerful selective effect on prey, and the prey develop anti-predator adaptations such as warning coloration, alarm calls and other signals, camouflage, mimicry of well-defended species, and defensive spines and chemicals. Sometimes predator and prey find themselves in an evolutionary arms race, a cycle of adaptations and counter-adaptations. Predation has been a major driver of evolution since at least the Cambrian period. Definition. Spider wasps paralyze and eventually kill their hosts, but are considered parasitoids, not predators. At the most basic level, predators kill and eat other organisms. However, the concept of predation is broad, defined differently in different contexts, and includes a wide variety of feeding methods. Moreover, some relationships that result in the prey's death are not necessarily called predation. A parasitoid, such as an ichneumon wasp, lays its eggs and are on its host. The eggs hatch into larvae, which eat the host, and it inevitably dies. Zoologists generally call this a form of parasitism, though conventionally parasites are thought not to kill their hosts. A predator can be defined to differ from a parasitoid in that it has many prey, captured over its lifetime, where a parasitoid's larva has just one, or at least has its food supply provisioned for it on just one occasion. 1-2. Relation of predation to other feeding strategies. There are other difficult and borderline cases. Micropredators are small animals that, like predators, feed entirely on other organisms. They include fleas and mosquitoes that consume blood from living animals, and aphids that consume sap from living plants. However, since they typically do not kill their hosts, they are now often thought of as parasites. 3-4 Animals that graze on phytoplankton or mats of microbes are predators, as they consume and kill their food organisms, while herbivores that browse leaves are not, as their food plants usually survive the assault. 5 When animals eat seeds, seed predation or granivory, or eggs, egg predation, they are consuming entire living organisms, which by definition makes them predators. 6, 7, 8. Scavengers, organisms that only eat organisms found already dead, or not predators, but many predators such as the jackal and the hyena scavenge when the opportunity arises. 9, 10, 5 Among invertebrates, social wasps such as yellowjackets are both hunters and scavengers of other insects. 11. Carnivorous plant, sundew engulfing an insect. Seed predation, mouse eating seeds. While examples of predators among mammals and birds are well known, 12 predators can be found in a broad range of taxa including arthropods. They are common among insects, including mantids, dragonflies, lacewings and scorpionflies. In some species such as the alderfly, only the larvae are. Taxonomic range. Predatory, the adults do not eat. Spiders are predatory, as well as other terrestrial invertebrates such as scorpions, centipedes, some mites, snails and slugs, nematodes, and planarian worms. 13. In marine environments, most cnidarians e.g., jellyfish, hydroids, ctenophora, comb jellies, echinoderms e.g., sea stars, sea urchins, sand dollars, and sea cucumbers and flatworms are predatory. 14. Among crustaceans, lobsters, crabs, shrimps and barnacles are predators. 15. And in turn crustaceans are preyed on by nearly all cephalopods, including octopuses, squid and cuttlefish. 16. Paramecium, a predatory ciliate, feeding on bacteria. Seed predation is restricted to mammals, birds, and insects but is found in almost all terrestrial ecosystems. 8. 6. Egg predation includes both specialist egg predators such as some colubrid snakes and generalists such as foxes and badgers that opportunistically take eggs when they find them. 17, 18, 19. Some plants, like the pitcher plant, the Venus flytrap and the sundew, are carnivorous and consume insects. 12 Methods of predation by plants varies greatly but often involves a food trap, mechanical stimulation, and electrical impulses to eventually catch and consume its prey. 20 Some carnivorous fungi catch nematodes using either active traps in the form of constricting rings, or passive traps with adhesive structures. 21. Many species of protozoa, eukaryotes, and bacteria, prokaryotes, prey on other microorganisms. The feeding mode is evidently ancient, and evolved many times in both groups. 22, 12, 23 Among freshwater and marine zooplankton, whether single-celled or multicellular, predatory grazing on phytoplankton and smaller zooplankton is common, and found in many species of nonoflagellates, dinoflagellates, ciliates, rotifers, a diverse range of meroplankton animal larvae, and 2 groups of crustaceans, namely copepods and cladocerans. 24. Foraging. A basic foraging cycle for a predator, with some variations indicated. 25. To feed, a predator must search for, pursue and kill its prey. These actions form a foraging cycle. 26, 27 The predator must decide where to look for prey based on its geographical distribution, and once it has located prey, it must assess whether to pursue it or to wait for a better choice. If it chooses pursuit, its physical capabilities determine the mode of pursuit, e.g., ambush or chase. 28, 29 Having captured the prey, it may also need to expend energy handling it, e.g., killing it, removing any shell or spines, and ingesting it. 25, 26 Search. Predators have a choice of search modes ranging from sit and wait to active or widely foraging. 30, 25, 31, 32 The sit and wait method is most suitable if the prey are dense and mobile, and the predator has low energy requirements. 30 Wide foraging expends more energy, and is used when prey is sedentary or sparsely distributed. 28, 30 There is a continuum of search modes with intervals between periods of movement ranging from seconds to months. Sharks, sunfish, insectivorous birds and shrews are almost always moving while web-building spiders, aquatic invertebrates, praying mantises and kestrels rarely move. In between, plovers and other shorebirds, freshwater fish including crappies, and the larvae of coccinellid beetles, ladybirds alternate between actively searching and scanning the environment. 30. The black-browed albatross regularly flies hundreds of kilometers across the nearly empty ocean to find patches of food. Prey distributions are often clumped, and predators respond by looking for patches where prey is dense and then searching within patches. 25. Where food is found in patches, such as rare shoals of fish in a nearly empty ocean, the search stage requires the predator to travel for a substantial time, and to expend a significant amount of energy to locate each food patch. 33. For example, the black-browed albatross regularly makes foraging flights to a range of around 700 kilometers, 430 miles, up to a maximum